so it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martin Pall. Dr. Pall was trained in physics, biochemistry, and genetics at Johns Hopkins and Caltech. He's a professor emeritus of biochemistry and basic medical sciences at Washington State University. He's a world-recognized authority in understanding the mechanisms of how wireless radiation affects biology and health. This past July, he was invited to present at an environmental health conference sponsored by the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. The fact that he was invited to present there is no small thing. As an NIH scientific reviewer and researcher myself, I can testify that despite what you've heard about science denial and corporate control of government, there are people in government who are committed to real science and who believe it should guide public health policy. So with grassroots gatherings like this, we can help build a public consensus to push for science-based policy, both locally and nationally. So let's welcome Dr. Pall, and let's work together for a healthy environment and community here in Eugene. Dr. Pall.
Well, yeah.
Just to, maybe people didn't realize, this is being live streamed. So it's being filmed in the back of the room, and it is being streamed, and it'll also be published online.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about a lot of materials that have to do with what kinds of evidence we have that tells us the things we know. And the reason I'm going to do this, even though some of this is going to go over your head, I think it's very important for you to have a good feeling for where, what kinds of evidence we have available. Because essentially everything I'm going to say are things that the industry will claim is not true. And so obviously you need to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, okay? And so I just want to say we scientists have a little secret. We rarely understand everything about the scientific papers that we read. But we get very good at telling what we do understand and what the importance is of what we do understand. And so I'm going to ask you to try to do the same thing here, okay? Okay. So, now, one of the things about this, I don't know, let's see, where are we here? I'm not seeing it. Oh, there it is. There's an arrow on this thing, but I'm not sure you can see it very well. Can you see it? Okay. So, the current U.S. and international safety guidelines are based on only thermal, that is, heating effects. It's based on the assumption that the only things that these EMFs can do is heat things. And yet we know that there are effects that occur orders of magnitude lower than those allowed by these guidelines. And those include lowered fertility. And let me just say, I'm going to be listing numbers of review articles, these are published review articles, that show each of these things. And so we have 18 different reviews that show there are various kinds of effects on fertility, both male fertility and female fertility, and that they also produce increased spontaneous abortions. They produce lowered levels of each of the 3 sex hormones and lowered libido. Okay? So it's no surprise their effects on reproduction. I'll talk about some of those later. There are widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, and we'll be discussing those in some detail later as well. There are 25 reviews on that. One of them is mine. There are effects on the cellular DNA. where the EMFs cause free radicals to attack the DNA of our cells. There are 21 different review articles on that. There's apoptosis, what's called programmed cell death. This is documented in 13 different reviews. That's important both for some of the reproductive and also some of the neurodegenerative effects. And there are also endocrine effects, hormonal effects, and there are 12 different reviews on that. There's excessive intracellular calcium. And this, as you will find out, is the cause of everything else that I'm talking about. Okay. And there are 35 reviews on cancer, on EMFs causing cancer. And yet we're still arguing about that issue, as you've probably seen in the press, even though there's overwhelming evidence on it, and has been overwhelming evidence for a very long time. So one other thing that's very important is that pulsed EMFs, EMFs that pulse up and down very rapidly, are in most cases much more biologically active than non-pulsed, or what are called continuous wave EMFs, of the same intensity. So what does that tell you? It tells you, first of all, the intensity really doesn't tell you very much about the biological activity. And it also tells you, because wireless communication devices all communicate via pulsations, that they are potentially, and I believe actually, much more dangerous. This is something, again, that the industry completely ignores. Now, there are 4 other probable effects, which I'll talk about briefly. They're cardiac effects, and these have to do with the effects on the electrical control of the heart. And there are also very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias, which we think are caused to at least some extent, and I think to a great extent, by the EMFs. We have people age 30 now developing Alzheimer's disease, something that's absolutely unheard of in previous years. They're still rare, not rare enough. Both ADHD and autism may be caused by late prenatal and early postnatal EMF exposures, and I'll talk about how those can work later on as well. So we have a lot of things that are very problematic. Let me just say, there are always questions about how much these things are caused by EMFs as opposed to other things. My judgment is that the EMFs are the predominant cause of what we're seeing, but some people may differ. Some people may differ on that. Obviously, the industry will differ on that. Now, how then are these effects produced? What's the mechanism by which these low-intensity EMFs can cause biological effects? So now we're getting to my own work on this. There are 28 different studies that have been published that have shown that various kinds of non-thermal effects of the EMFs can be blocked or greatly lowered by using what are called calcium channel blockers. These are drugs that are specific for blocking what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. And I'll abbreviate them. Where is this thing? Okay. VGCCs, so you're going to hear that a lot. Okay, so what are those? These are so every cell in our body has a plasma membrane around it. And in the plasma membrane are a number of channels that can open up and allow things to move back and forth. One of the most important of those are these voltage-gated calcium channels, the VGCCs. And when they open up, and it's the opening of the channel that's produced by the EMFs, they allow huge amounts of calcium to flow into the cell. And it's the excessive calcium in the cell that's responsible for most, if not all, of the biological effects here. Okay? And I'll tell you how those effects can be generated. by the excessive calcium. Now, the calcium levels are normally maintained very low inside of cells. Under most normal circumstances, they're about 1/10,000th of the calcium outside the cell. And so, obviously, what that tells you, it's important to keep calcium levels low. We do allow calcium to flow in to produce very short-term regulatory changes, but when you have excessive activation of those channels, then you have lots of problems, and that's exactly what we're seeing with the EMFs. So, okay. So there are 5 different other types of evidence that each provide further support for this VGCC mechanism, and so I don't have time to talk about all those things, but one of the things that I do want to talk about is how those channels are regulated. We think that the direct target of the EMFs is a structure in the channel called a voltage sensor. This is a structure which detects the electrical charge across the plasma membrane. And as you'll see in a minute, that structure is extraordinarily sensitive to the electrical forces that are placed on it by the EMFs. And that's why the EMFs are so active in activating it. Okay, so and so the point is, the industry acknowledges that microwave and lower frequency EMFs can put forces on electrically charged groups, but they state that the forces produced are too low to do anything. And what I'm going to show you is why their claim is wrong. Now, this is a model. It's a 2-dimensional model of what the VGCCs look like with the voltage sensor. And so let me just say, first of all, those cylinders that you see there, the blue ones and the orange ones, are all what are called alpha helices. They're part of the protein that forms a helix that kind of has a structure that's kind of cylindrical, okay? And that's what those are. And they are in the plasma membrane, and the plasma membrane is this structure that goes through it, you can see. And what's true is that those orange helices, the ones that are colored orange, you look at them, they have 5 pluses on each of them. Those are each positive charges. Okay, so they're positive electrical charges. Those 4 orange helices are the voltage sensor. They are the thing that detects electrical changes across the plasma membrane. And what I'm going to argue is that the forces on those charges that are put on it, because of the physics of this structure, are extraordinarily strong. Okay? So the first thing is that that helix is actually bent. It's not straight up and down, it's actually bent. So it's in the lipid section of the membrane. It's in the fatty section of the membrane. That turns out to be very important for 2 reasons. One is that the forces on those charges that are produced are predicted by what's called Coulomb's law. Coulomb's law is a law of physics that was first proposed back in 1784. So it's old physics. And what it says is the forces on the charges is inversely proportional with the dielectric constant that they're in. Okay. Now the dielectric constant of the membrane is about 1/120th of the dielectric constant of the aqueous parts, the watery parts of the cell. So what does that mean? It means the forces on those charges are about 120 times stronger. Okay? And so it turns out that there are 3 factors then that influence the electrical forces. One is there are 20 charges. And we're comparing this now with singly charged groups that are in the aqueous parts of the cell. There are 20 charges on the voltage sensor, not one. Coulomb's law predicts that the forces are about 120 times higher on each of those. And then there's another factor that's even bigger, and that is the fact that the plasma membrane has a very high electrical resistance. Predicts from another old law of physics called Ohm's law that the electrical gradients across the plasma membrane are going to be amplified about 3,000-fold. So that means the forces are a factor of another 3,000. And what that means then is that compared with the forces on singly charged groups in the aqueous phases of the cell, the forces here are about 20 times 120 times 3,000, which is equal to 7.2 million times stronger than the forces on singly charged electrical groups in the aqueous parts of the cell. So we have extremely high forces predicted by the physics on this structure, which I believe is exactly why we are so incredibly sensitive to these very low intensity EMFs, okay? And so all of the industry propaganda disintegrates when you see this, okay? Everything, all their claims. There's another finding here that I mentioned here, and that is there was a paper published in 2016 that showed that you could take isolated plasma membranes, so no cells, just isolated membranes, and you can activate those VGCCs by simply exposing them to microwave frequency EMFs, low intensity microwave frequency EMFs. So we know it's a direct activation. Okay. Now, so that tells you why the system is so sensitive. Then the question is, how does it produce all the different effects? And the answer is, these are the things that happen then when you activate those VGCCs. So you have various frequencies, and let me say these also include the frequencies that are going to be used for 5G, but also many other frequencies, including the frequency in our power wiring. And they all work through VGCC activation. You get then increases in intracellular calcium, that's what this is. And the intracellular calcium then produces a number of things. One is you get much higher levels of calcium signaling. Calcium signaling is very important in the body. And you get too much of it, and it causes lots of problems. And so that's one thing that is going on here, and we know it's going on here. The other thing is you also get increases in both nitric oxide and superoxide. Both of these increase from the calcium. And they react with each other to form peroxynitrite, which is this guy. Peroxynitrite is a potent oxidant. It's not a free radical, but it breaks down to form free radicals, reactive free radicals. And they produce oxidative stress, and they also produce inflammation by activating something called NF-kappa B. So you have inflammation, you have oxidative stress, you get free radical attacks of various sorts, and they're involved in the pathophysiology of the various kinds of things that are going on, okay? Now, there are other things that are going on. I'll just mention them very briefly. One is there are genuine therapeutic effects of the EMFs under certain circumstances. And they can be produced along this pathway, where you get nitric oxide signaling pathway, and it can produce therapeutic effects in this way. There are also effects that are involved in binding of nitric oxide to cytochromes, and so I probably won't talk about those, but they can be important in some situations. So what I'm saying here is that we know a lot about how all these things work, and we know a lot about how they produce things. And I'll talk about some of the specifics just a bit later on. Now, there are several other things which are of concern here to many people. One is there are 4 reasons why EMFs are much more active in children than in adults. And in general, the younger they are, the more active the EMFs are. Again, everything I say the industry will deny. I guarantee it. And the reasons there are basically 4 reasons that have been identified. One is children have much higher surface to volume ratio, so their tissues are much more exposed. Secondly, stem cells are very sensitive to the EMFs, and the younger you are, the higher the density of stem cells that you have in your body. So that's a big issue. The developing brain appears to be especially sensitive to the EMFs, and I'll talk about that later in terms of what mechanisms we think are happening there. And then young tissues have a lot more extracellular water content than the older tissues do, and this leads to much deeper penetration of the effects. So there are 4 reasons then why we're particularly concerned about children in general, and there's been a lot of concern about Wi-Fi and cell phone tower radiation in schools for these reasons. And let me just say again, industry will deny everything I say. Now, there are lots of things. Okay, so when you look at the different things we talked about that are produced by the EMFs, one of them is oxidative stress, and that I guess I've already talked about actually. From you get that off of the peroxynitrite and free radicals, and we know in fact that peroxynitrite levels are elevated following EMF exposures. You get this lowered male and female fertility, and there are a number of ways in which that works, but again, everything comes off of those pathways that I talked about before as far as we can tell. And and now we have the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, and it turns out that the VGCCs are extremely active throughout the entire nervous system. And part of the reason for that is because the VGCCs have roles in the release of every single neurotransmitter in the whole nervous system. So they have very important functions in the nervous system. They have very high densities. The nervous system, including the brain, is the most sensitive organ in the body to the EMFs. And so you get various effects involved in producing the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, including the stimulation of release of many of the neurotransmitters. And you get the oxidative stress, and you get lots of other things going on. So, and calcium signaling is very important in the nervous system, as you know, basically I've already stated. So when you get excessive calcium signaling, that causes lots of problems. Now, apoptosis, programmed cell death, can be produced in 3 ways as a consequence of the EMF exposures and the downstream effects of the VGCC activation. You get cellular DNA damage, basically, because the free radicals that we talked about attack the DNA directly, okay? And they produce single-strand breaks, they produce double-strand breaks, they produce oxidized bases in the cellular DNA. All of those are important. All of them can produce important mutational effects. And let me just say, one of my concerns is that we know that this is going on in human sperm following common exposures that we have. You know, Wi-Fi, cell phones, etc. Cell phone towers. We know they go on in human sperm. And so what that means is that there is, there's a genuine fear that we're going to have, and we may already have, high levels of mutations passed on to future generations. And so that could be an extraordinary problem. It's it's probably my 3rd most important problem on my list. And then there are changes in the hormone levels. And again, we have both effects on non-steroid hormones and on steroid hormones. They work through somewhat different mechanisms. So, you get lots of hormonal effects, and then there's calcium overload, which is the cause of everything else. we've already said. Okay, so let's go on here. Now, 5 of the effects, based on the best available evidence, and I'm not saying it's absolutely bulletproof, but based on the best available evidence, 5 of the effects appear to be cumulative, and as they become more severe, they tend to be irreversible. And those are the reproductive effects, or at least part of the reproductive effects, the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. Germline mutational effects are inherently cumulative and irreversible. The cardiac effects and the Alzheimer's and other dementias, those all are based on the best available evidence, cumulative effects, and as they become more severe, they become irreversible. Now let's talk about reproduction. Okay, one of my top 2 concerns is the threat to human reproduction. And so let me just tell you what we know. And we know that sperm counts in every single technologically advanced country on Earth have dropped below 50% of normal. We know that reproduction rates in those countries have dropped well below replacement levels in every single one of those countries, with a single exception. And there was a study done published now over 20 years ago by Magros and Zinos that showed that EMFs could lead, and these are EMFs well within our safety guideline levels, so they're levels that shouldn't produce any changes at all if the levels have any biological relevance. And what happened was that there was, these were done with mice, young pairs of mice, and what was found, and mice, by the way, have a gestation period of about 30 days. So you can produce a litter very quickly. And so they found that these mice, and at 2 different levels of exposure, at the higher level of exposure, again, well within our safety guidelines, they produced 2 litters, but they were both depressed, so lower than normal levels of reproduction. And then they crashed to 0. And apparently the crash to 0 was irreversible. At the lower level exposure, basically the same pattern, it just took 5 litters to do the same thing that happened in 3 litters. Okay? Now, so I've looked at this, and I've looked at what information we have, and generally things work much faster in rodents than they do in humans. Something like 15 times faster. And you can make an estimate that the EMFs, and we've already seen there are effects on reproduction. We don't have proof that they're caused by the EMFs, but those are the obvious mechanisms that are likely to be involved because they are so widely distributed through all these technologically advanced countries based on the industry claims that they can't possibly do anything to impact our health. And so I expect we're going to see a crash in reproduction in something like 5 years. Now, let me just say that if we do have that, it won't be quite as uniform as it was with the mice because we have more variations in exposures from one person to another. Nevertheless, if you've already got massive effects on human sperm, it's clearly the case that almost everybody is impacted by these. And so we don't have large numbers of people who are totally unimpacted. I mean, and so this is an issue. Now, I have to say, when you have, some of the reproduction levels in these countries have dropped well below 60% of replacement levels, so they've dropped quite a bit. But, when you see these data, you really can't really tell how much of this is due to the EMFs and how much is not. But then the question is, well, are we seeing any evidence that we're starting to see crashes in reproduction? And because we know, as I've said, we know that in animals you can get crashes in reproduction. It turns out that between 2016 and 2017, Singapore, very technologically advanced, very dense population country, had a 31% drop in reproduction. Macau, Macau, of course, is not really another country, but it keeps statistics separately like a country. And it dropped 26% also between 2016 and 2017. South Korea had a drop of 11% in 2017 and a further drop of 9% in the first half of 2018. Now, normally, you see big drops in reproduction if you have a war, you have a famine, you have a huge economic crash. You see these things, but none of these things apply here. So, although I can't say for certain that we're seeing the crash from the EMFs, but I think what's clearly true is we're taking absolutely extraordinary risks of a sort that no rational society could possibly take. Now, let's talk about the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. In my review on this, I came to a list involving insomnia, fatigue, depression, headache, lack of concentration, cognitive dysfunction, anxiety, stress, agitation. Did I say depression? I'm not sure. Depression and headaches, memory dysfunction. These are things that, as I think we all know, are becoming close to universal. These are things that people complain about all the time, not only in the U.S., but in all these technologically advanced countries. And we know they're caused by EMFs, and nobody's paying any attention to it. Now, let me just say, the list that I had, actually, there were other studies that came up with very similar lists that were reviewed. The first two reviews that were published on this in terms of EMF causation were, one was published in 1967, the other one in 1971. There are a number of other reviews that have been published with similar lists of effects, okay? So, my paper actually wasn't unique in terms of the effects. What my paper was unique was in terms of documenting that these were causal effects of EMFs, and that obviously is an important thing. Now, when you do animal studies, you get massive changes over time in the brain, and they start out slow. You get relatively modest changes, and they become more and more severe with time of exposure to a particular kind of EMF, particular intensity of EMF. And so you see cumulative effects. And those then become irreversible as they become more severe, because if you take the EMFs away, if you do that early on, when the effects are modest, they go back to normal, or pretty close back to normal. If you wait, they become much more severe, and they become irreversible. Very much the same thing seems to be happening with the best evidence of these neurological and neuropsychiatric effects in humans. Okay, so we think that the best available evidence is that they are cumulative and irreversible. So again, and we have reason to think we're already far along in this process. My prediction, I hate to say this, is that if we keep going, just simply based on the exposures we already have, we will have a crash in our collective brain function as the structure and function of our brains deteriorates further and further. And therefore, we will go into utter chaos. That's my prediction if we keep going. And that's simply based on the exposures we already have. I'm not talking about 5G yet. Okay? So, again, we are taking risks that no rational society can possibly take. Okay. Well, I guess I've already made all these points, so I don't think. Okay, we'll get to that. Let's go on. Speaking of the devil. Okay, let's talk about ADHD and autism. And let me just say, I don't really have time to talk about the evidence that's involved here. We do know that that mutations that lead to excessive VGCC activity can cause autism. We do know that elevated levels of the VGCCs have a role in causing autism in the general autism population. And we do know that other things that affect calcium levels also have roles in causing autism. So in general, there's an argument on that. Let me just say, with ADHD, we have actually some good animal studies that have shown that EMFs can cause ADHD-like effects in animals. And so I think there we have more experimental evidence. But there's lots of other evidence that comes into this, but it would take too long to really talk about it. Now, what do I think is happening here in autism and ADHD? I think basically they're similar, except that autism is in general much more severe. If you look at where is this? Here you go. I think the main action is coming along this pathway here. The main mechanism of action. We get a low-intensity microwave and low-frequency EMFs activating the VGCCs, producing excessive calcium, intracellular calcium. And that what that does is it disrupts the synapse formation in the developing brain, okay? So there are 5 mechanisms which are known to be involved in the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. These are the ones that are listed here. And each of them is regulated by intracellular calcium. And so each of them can be screwed up by excessive calcium in the cell. And so that's what I think is happening here. And so, in the late prenatal and early postnatal period, there's a huge amount of synaptic formation that's going on during that entire period. And therefore, I think the brains are hypersensitive to these effects during those developmental periods, and therefore are hypersensitive to the EMFs, and that then disrupts synapse formation. Now, autism is a very complex disease. And I'm not trying to tell you that that's all that's going on. It's not. Among the other things that are going on is that a substantial minority of autism cases also have a mutational effect. Now, I mentioned before that we know that that the EMFs produce DNA changes that can have mutational effects. and the specific types of mutations that are produced through the oxidized bases and the breaks in the cellular DNA are the kinds of mutations that have been implicated in autism. And those mutations are ones that specifically, either directly or indirectly, have an impact on synapse formation. Okay? So that makes sense. Now, there are also chemical effects, and I believe that they're less important than the EMFs, but that's something that reasonable people may differ on. And they go through this pathway, and they also produce increased calcium. And then there are other things in here which I won't talk about. But so I think we can understand the whole autism thing. My opinion is that the EMFs are the main driver of this, but there are also chemical effects that are clearly implicated as well. If the EMFs are the main driver of the epidemic, then, you know, we're in extraordinarily deep trouble. So the latest figure on autism in the U.S. was 1 birth in 38. And as I think you know, every single autism child impacts the entire family. That data, if I remember correctly, is based on children who were born in either 2009 or 2010. And of course, we've had huge amounts of increases in exposure since that time, including from smart meters and various other things. So we have no idea what the level will be as the children born in 2018 develop. We have no idea at all. It could be 1 in 20, it could be 1 in 10, it could be 1 in 5, it could even be 1 in 2. We have no idea. Absolutely no idea. Now, and of course, when you go in and you generate more EMFs in something like 5G, and that'll be huge amounts, it could be that every child will be an autism child. We'll get there. Hold on. All right, so let me just say, this is the way I think the chemicals act, and I just wanted to show you this because I used to work on this, on these pathways, and so they also work through producing excessive intracellular calcium, and there's one other thing I think that's important here. And this is speculation, but I think it's important speculation. This is Dr. Boyd Haley has proposed that other types of male dysfunction, and we have very common male dysfunction in our societies, and in fact in other societies around the world, that they are produced by the same mechanisms as are involved in producing autism. And we have a widespread problem with this. Now, why are we talking about male dysfunction here? It's because, in part because autism is about 4.5 times more common in males than in females. ADHD is about 3.5 times more common in males than in females. And we have a whole literature which says, for whatever reason, that male babies and male fetuses are hypersensitive to influences that cause autism, and so again, I don't really have time to talk about what that evidence is, but there is evidence on that. So it's eminently reasonable then that other types of effects produced by this same mechanism would affect males more than females, and therefore that this might be the cause of male dysfunction. Now, if that's true, given the fact that we have we've had such extraordinary, you know, so it's most of the, you know, the young males who are teenagers or adult, you know, or adults who were dysfunctional. They were, you know, they were babies when the levels were vastly lower than they are now, orders of magnitude lower than they are now. And so if this interpretation is correct, then we will have a gigantic epidemic of male dysfunction coming down the pike, even if we stopped all exposures tomorrow based on the exposures we've already had. Okay? So we are taking absolutely stunning risks. This is another area where, you know, I mean, the risks that we're taking are just absolutely stunning. Okay. Let's talk about smart meters. I promised to talk about smart meters. Smart meters, okay, so I talked before about pulsations. And smart meters work via, you know, short bursts that are highly, highly pulsed. So there's a very high pulsation levels in the smart meter radiation. And that's something then that suggests that, and that, by the way, yeah, it's been shown by Dr. Merritt and Dr. Carl Merritt. There are only 2 studies on smart meter effects that we have. One is the Lamech study that was done in Australia, and the Conrad study that was done in the U.S. Each of these was done with no outside funding. So, you know, basically with nickels and dimes or whatever the version of that is in Australia. And, you know, the methods used in the studies were quite different, but they actually found very similar results, and I think that's important. Each of them found that smart meters produce large increases in neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, not too much different than the ones that I discussed earlier. And they also affect cardiac effects, and then they also produce large increases in electromagnetic hypersensitivity, EHS. That's very important because you know, when you're EHS, of course, you're hypersensitive, and so you react much more to the EMFs. Now, let me just say, I'm not going to talk about EHS, but EHS, I think, is a well-documented phenomenon. The industry, of course, denies everything I have to say, including this especially. But you know, that's the world we live in. Let me just say one other thing about smart meters. Most of these effects, in response to most of the radiation that we get exposed to, tend to develop very slowly over time. And that's one of the reasons why we're often unaware of them, because they do develop slowly. However, there are many, many anecdotal reports on smart meters which have argued that they're very rapid effects. That suggests that the smart meters are much more dangerous than most of the other radiation that we get exposed to. So that's okay. What about circumcision? You know, when I say that these things are caused by EMFs, what I am saying is we have extensive evidence that clearly shows they are caused by EMFs. And it's not just epidemiological evidence, experimental evidence. And so, you know, that still leaves open the question of when you see these effects in the population, how much of that is caused by the EMFs. I'm giving you my opinions about what the situation is, but obviously one can question this. Well, I published a paper on EMFs in plants, and it has a whole bunch of citations in it. No, actually, and that's, I think if you go into the Google Scholar database and you put my name in and electromagnetic fields in plants, you'll find the paper and you can download it. Okay. Okay. Oh, this is a smart meter affecting a plant. Just coincidentally here. Showing yet again that smart meters actually do things to living organisms, despite the claims to the contrary. Okay, so let's talk about 5G. Now, what is 5G? 5G is an attempt to communicate very large amounts of information in very short time periods. Okay, and that's and the decision that's been made is to use what are called millimeter wave frequencies. These are much higher frequencies than the microwave frequencies. And the reason that that decision was made is that you can communicate much higher amounts of information using the millimeter waves because they pulse much more. They can pulse much more rapidly. And you also have much more bandwidth. The consequences, however, is that because of that, first of all, the 5G signals don't penetrate well through the walls of our buildings and so forth. And so the plan is to put out tens of millions of these 5G antennae all over the place where you cannot avoid them, so that there'll be enough of these signals to penetrate into our buildings such that we can, load porn videos faster? And communicate with all kinds of other things. And so the plan is to have just incredible amounts of EMFs going back and forth. Okay. Now, it's this we had 2G, we had 3G generation. It's a generation of cell phones and whatever. Yeah. So okay, so it's my opinion that 5G will be vastly more dangerous than the things that preceded it. And I think that that's true for three reasons I'm going to talk about right now, and then I'm going to talk later about a fourth reason. The three reasons are, first of all, when you have something that gets absorbed well, it's usually absorbed because it's interacting with electrically charged groups. And you have, that's true with microwaves, and it's probably true of the 5G millimeter waves as well. What that argues then is that this thing is probably going to be particularly active in interacting with the charges on the voltage sensor. So it's going to be particularly active in producing biological effects. Okay. Secondly, because of the extremely high level of pulsation, and we know pulsation is important here, it will be extremely biologically active as well for that reason. And then it'll be extremely active because there are all these damn antennae all over the place where you can't avoid them. So particularly when you're outdoors and you have nothing to protect you, you're going to be exposed to huge levels of these things, gigantic levels. The plan, which has already been approved by the FCC and by the Congress, is to put out tens of millions of these 5G antennae without doing one single biological safety test. You might argue that I'm wrong about this, but the obvious thing to do is to test these things. To put them out without testing is just an incredible outrage. Now, one of the things the industry claims is that, you don't have to worry about 5G because it gets absorbed in the outer 1 millimeter of our bodies, and so it won't do anything further in. That's what they claim, okay? Now, what I'm going to tell you is that that's not really true, but it is true in some sense. And to the extent that that is true, however, what it means is that 5G will impact almost every single organism on Earth more than it will impact us. And I think it'll impact us a hell of a lot. Because most of the organisms have much more surface area to interact with. And so I think there'll be massive effects on insects, on small mammals and birds, and on plants. And even large trees have their leaves and their reproductive organs highly exposed. So I think we're going to have all kinds of ecological disasters that go beyond anything that I can imagine. Now let's look at the issue of penetration, okay? So we talked about the fact that the 5G, it is the case that the electrical parts of the 5G EMFs are largely absorbed, but the magnetic parts are much more penetrating. The same thing is true of the electrical parts, the microwave frequency EMFs. The magnetic parts are much more penetrating. And in the industry has been claiming for years that, well, that microwave frequency stuff can only affect the outer centimeter or so of our body. And we know absolutely that's wrong. Okay? And the best example of that is, the most extreme example of that, is a study that was done by Professor Hessig and his colleagues in Switzerland. It's discussed at the bottom of the slide. And who published 2 studies showing that when pregnant cattle graze near a cell phone tower, they produce large numbers of newborn calves with high incidences of cataracts. So what that means is that the fetus is buried very deeply in the mother's body and therefore should be highly protected from this microwave radiation. In fact, is not so protected, and you get lots of cataracts produced. And so what does that tell you? One of the things it tells you is the fetal tissue is much more sensitive. The mothers don't develop cataracts. The fetus does. Another thing that it tells you is that this thing is extremely penetrating. Something like 40 times more penetrating than the industry claims is possible. And the other thing about it is that Switzerland has safety guidelines that are 100 times more stringent than ours. So even at that lower level exposures, you're seeing effects much more deeply. Okay. So, talk about red flags. Now, so I believe that 5G will be much more penetrating as well. And so then the question is, how can these penetrating effects be produced? And let me just say, I said before that the EMFs work on the voltage sensor through electrical forces. But the electrical parts of the EMFs are absorbed. So how does it work? I think the way it works is very simple. And again, it comes straight out of the physics. When you have a magnetic field that's penetrating, it will put forces on dissolved ions in the aqueous parts of our bodies, and it will move them. And by moving these electrically charged groups, it will regenerate the initial electrical parts of the EMFs. Same frequency, same pulsations, just much lower intensity. But when you have a voltage sensor that is so extraordinarily sensitive to these EMFs, you've got a perfect mechanism for generating effects in the body. And so I think that 5G will be greatly penetrating. It may be particularly active in producing some things that are associated with aqueous parts of the body, like producing huge epidemics of blindness because of the aqueous and vitreous humors in the eye, like producing kidney failure because there are obviously lots of fluid in the kidney. There may be prenatal abnormalities because of the amniotic fluid. at high levels. And there may be severe vascular effects because we've got all this fluid in the blood. So, things will be, so I think we're going to generate all the stuff that, these other EMFs generate, but there'll also be other things that will be generated that will be maybe particularly active from 5G. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong about some of these things. Maybe I'm wrong about all these things. But you do not put out these EMFs without doing biological safety testing. It is an atrocity beyond belief to do that. Thank you very much.
Do we have some questions over here?
You're going to read them. Okay, so we've got written questions. Okay. Yeah. Here's the...
Can you read these?
I don't know.
You want to just...
Let's see. It says, I've read that the brain doesn't completely develop until around 25 years old. Some people think it takes longer than that. Let's see. Is the first full 25 years in which humans are most vulnerable to EMFs? I don't know what I mean. We have reason to think that these, in the prenatal, early postnatal period, there's high levels of sensitivity in the developing brain. I don't know about what happens after that, but there are things that occur in development, certainly well into the teenage years, that you might think would be sensitive as well. I thought about that. Okay. Okay, I have solar panels and had a digital type meter installed then, required. Now how do I get that meter back? I'm sorry. What the meter has to do with the solar panels, I'm not sure. Oh, I see. I see. Okay. I don't know. Has anybody got an answer to that? Yeah, solar panels will increase the EMFs. You might talk about that. Well, I think the problem with solar photovoltaics is the inverters. The inverters that are sold are usually digital inverters, and they generate lots of dirty electricity as a consequence of that. And so that's the main problem. You can get inverters that are much safer. I'm not an expert on where to get them, but you can get them. I know that. So I don't know that that solar electricity is inherently bad, but I think the way we've been doing it has often been bad. And the same thing I think is true for wind power. We're doing these things on the cheap without consideration of the human health effects, and that's problematic. Okay, do extension audio wired headphones into a cell phone help or act as an antenna? So this is what, Bluetooth? Regular wires? I don't know. Maybe somebody here knows. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, basically what the question would be, well, an air thing should be better than a wired thing. Yeah, right. Okay. What is broadband? Okay. Well, okay. It has to do, I think, with my comment that you have a lot of bandwidth with 5G. So in general, the the higher the frequency, the more bandwidth you have, because there's just, you know, lots more frequencies within a particular range. So the idea is that you do have you know, much more bandwidth with these very high frequencies. The problem is, as I've said, you know, they have real problems on their own because of the lack of penetration. And let me just say, you know, the studies that I've seen on millimeter wave radiation have all been on non-pulsed, that is continuous wave millimeter wave radiation. And none of those really tell you how bad 5G is going to be. Having said that, I think that the effects that I've seen are really pretty bad for the millimeter wave stuff. And so that is not at all encouraging. Multiple sclerosis, I think, yeah, has been reported to be caused by EMS, but I really don't know that literature, so I can't comment on it, huh? Will it get worse? If our exposures get worse, everything's going to get worse. And how do we challenge the Telecommunications Act to prevent to prevent 5G installation? I don't know. There have been some attempts to do that, and I don't know where they've gone. Does anybody know here? There, you know, the other thing that's happening is, as Kathy Ging mentioned, was there some municipalities that have simply, you know, said we're not going to allow 5G. Whether that will be supported in the courts, I don't know, but that's something that can be done. I mean, I don't know. I think the other thing that could be done is just simply boycott these companies. The question is, how can you get enough people to boycott them to actually make it pinch? Yeah. Well, you know, yeah, mitigation. How can you do that? I think, you know, obviously there is shielding material that you can use, that you can wear, etc., that will help protect yourself from the EMFs. And okay, let me. I've got this one here. You can wear something like this. You can actually see through this thing, and you can read through this thing, and it kind of looks like hell, but it protects your head, and which it's made of. It has little tiny metallic fibers in mixed with the other fibers. So it's this thing I bought from Less EMF. Costs about $35. It's not dirt cheap, but on the other hand. I usually, yeah, I carry it at night, and if I'm, you know, staying in a hotel that's got Wi-Fi or something, I'll wear that, and I'll wear you can wear a shirt that's similarly, you know, has similar fibers in it. Okay, we can wear these at night in hotels. I actually got, before I knew much about EMFs, I gave a talk in Copenhagen, and I was put up in a hotel overnight. The first night I was there, and I couldn't sleep that night, and I got up the next morning and looked out, and there was a cell phone tower on the next building beaming right through the window. And I think it caused neurological damage to me, which is still there. But so anyway, but yeah, there's lots of problems. So, okay, can too much calcium? Okay, no, okay. I was going to talk about a little bit more, another thing about mitigation. Okay, and this is something that I'm not sure I can tell you, I can explain to you very clearly. There is a very important regulatory system in the body, which is called NRF2, NRF number 2. Okay. I published a paper on this, which you can get off of the PubMed database by just putting in my name and NRF2, NRF number 2. I think this is an extraordinarily important regulatory system. There are a number of studies that have reported that nutrients that raise NRF2, and they're discussed in my paper, help protect this from EMF effects. This is not a magic bullet. I want to emphasize that, but it may still be useful. There are a lot of health-promoting nutritional factors and other factors which act by raising NRF2. And so, and one of the things that raising NRF2 does is produces a lot of antioxidant enzymes, which help protect us from the oxidative stress part of that. But there are also other things that it does that also may be important in protecting us from EMF effects. So, and and let me just say, I'm a Ph.D., not an M.D. Nothing I say should be viewed as medical advice. What? The nutrients? Look at the paper. There are a lot of them. Okay, let me give you a few of them. There are a lot of terpenoids that do it. There are carotenoids. The long-chain omega-3s in fish oil do it. Many of the most active antioxidants actually act through NRF2. Their action through NRF2 is more important than their direct effect as antioxidants. Some of the phenolic antioxidants, some of the most active phenolic antioxidants. So there are a number of them. There are a number of others in addition. And so, I think that this is I think this can be useful. Anyway, as I say, I'm a Ph.D., not an M.D. Nothing I view should be viewed as medical advice. How can Wi-Fi in laptops and desktops be used safely? Simple. Wire it. Don't use Wi-Fi. Use it wired. If you ask the company to turn off the Wi-Fi, you need a meter to make sure they actually did it. Okay? So, I mean, I've had that happen to me, where they say they've done it and they haven't. For the home, is there shielding material for walls against EMFs? Yeah, there are, and probably graphite paint is probably the simplest of them. But you can use other things as well. You can buy shielding materials from less EMF, but the graphite paint is the cheapest way to go. It's black paint, so you can paint over it with some other color, so you don't have to look at black paint. So that's good. When you talk about shielding windows, of course, it's more difficult and more expensive. You can do it, but it costs more. You can get materials not too much different from this that you can use as curtains, but they're expensive. Yeah, it'll help. But will it shield against 5G? Yeah, I mean, I think you can shield yourself in your house from 5G. The problem is you don't want to be cooped up in your house and not be able to go outside. I mean, this whole thing is insane. Yeah. Okay. Can anyone access, or do we need special clearance to access your papers? Okay. So my papers on EMFs, there are 6 of them that are in the PubMed database. You can find them easily by just, again, putting in my name and electromagnetic. 5 of those are public access, so you can access them. There's a little thing on the upper right corner where you click on it and access the publisher's website and get them. The 6th one, which was the one I wrote that was strictly on therapy, is not public access. the other two papers, one of them is not accessible at all. The other one is in an engineering journal, which I wrote to tell the industry what they should be doing. Of course, they paid great attention to that. And that's in a journal that I forget their name, but their acronym is EGREM, IJIREM. And you can probably Google EGREM and find the paper. It's public access as well. You can get it off the publisher's website. Oh, the plant paper, I believe you can get off of Google Scholar database. Yeah, there's been a lot of concern about 5G from space because obviously it's going to be all over the place. I think, you know, I really haven't researched it that much, but I think that it's quite possible there will be, you know, I mean, you know, you put it in space, you're going to have gigantic ecological consequences. We might have crashes of ecosystems all over the planet or something like that. You know, I guess, you know, I mean, you know, I sound like the worst apocalypse movie that you've ever heard of. I apologize for that, but that's where the science leads me. Well, I think, you know, if you look at, you know, there was a very good book that was written called Doubt is Their Product. It was published, it was written by David Michaels, who's an academic at Georgetown University. It was published about 10 years ago. And he talks about a whole series of industries that basically have corrupted the science. And when you look at those, and those include the tobacco companies, and it includes asbestos, and it includes, I think, mercury and the oil companies with global warming and all these things, and the drug companies, interestingly, and okay, I didn't remember that, but maybe it did.
The correct title is Merchants of Doubt.
No, that's a different one.
Is that a different
That's
book?
a different book. Yeah,
There's two.
yeah. There's a different book. Yeah, I haven't read that one, so I'm not commenting on it. But I have read Doubt is Their Product. Now, what I wanted to say is that, in my judgment, the way in which the telecom companies have gone about corrupting the science is very similar to what these other companies have done. There's not that much difference between them or among them. But the consequences are vastly greater, because here we have multiple existential threats to our survival. None of those had any existential threats. They had major consequences, but not of that order. So, you know, yeah. Okay, so here's a question about smart meters affecting melatonin and the sleep cycle. Okay, so first of all, a lot of different EMFs lower nocturnal melatonin. So you need melatonin at night to sleep, and it lowers your melatonin levels. That's true with many of them, not just not just smart meters, but many things. Smart meters, I said before, may be particularly active, but I haven't seen anything specifically on melatonin. And does it affect the sleep cycle? Well, yes, of course it does. Is this the only thing that EMFs do that cause us to have difficulty sleeping? I think the answer is no, it's not. And the reason I say that is that some people find melatonin to be quite helpful to help sleep, who are having problems with EMFs. But other people still do not sleep well even with melatonin. My opinion is that there's at least one other thing that's going on, and my candidate for that is high levels of nocturnal norepinephrine. Okay, so norepinephrine, I talked about the fact that they're hormone effects, okay? And norepinephrine levels can be high at night because of the EMFs, and that's the fight or flight hormone. Well, when you have fight or flight, you don't sleep very well. So that's my opinion, is that's what's going on. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Tinnitus? Yeah, okay, so there is a literature that EMFs cause tinnitus, and I guess, you know, in fact, smart meters cause tinnitus. That's been one of the things that they showed. And there are other things. Heavy cell phone use can cause tinnitus. So there are other kinds of EMFs that can do that. I think with regard to whether it will go away, my opinion is I try raising nerve 2. Okay, that's an opinion. I'm not going to spend the time to tell you why. You know, try raising nerve 2 and see if it works. It'll take some time probably. Okay, how far does radiation come into the house from a smart meter? Well, it'll come in as far, I mean, it will come in all over the place. You know, you have two things going on, right, with smart meters. First of all, you have the direct radiation from the meter itself, and that, of course, will decrease with increasing distance, but there's still some radiation there. The other thing has to do with the dirty electricity, and that'll come from all your wiring, and you've got wiring all over the place, so that will impact you wherever you are. So anyway, that's, yep, okay. Is there a way to treat VG? Well, okay, good question. All right, so first of all, can you treat VGCC-caused problems, illness? The VGCCs have essential roles in the body. Okay, they are found in, as far as I can tell, every single cell in the body. They have important roles in, particularly in the nervous system and in the heart and in the endocrine systems. But they also have roles in all kinds of other things. So you cannot completely block them, you know. You just can't do that. You won't be able to function, period, you know. So people have tried using calcium channel blockers to see if they help, particularly with EHS. So far, it's not clear that can work clinically. Having said that, there are studies where people have used calcium channel blockers to deal with brain-related problems, including the neurodegenerative diseases. And so I would think about, if I were a researcher, or I think about trying those specific types of calcium channel blockers at the kind of doses that are being used there to see if they might work. But there's no data on this, so that's. There are other drugs which also lower the VGCC activity. And there's one of them, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. Cromolyn, which I'm excited about, but maybe my excitement is misplaced. Cromolyn is a drug which acts to lower the VGCC activities. I think it may act by directly interacting with the voltage sensor. I don't know that. I'm just basing that on the chemical structure of it. It's a natural compound, but it's used as a drug. And because it's a natural compound doesn't mean it's completely benign, of course. But it seems to lower the excitability of the VGCCs. and it seems to be well tolerated under the conditions where it is used clinically. So and let me just say, the main use in this country is as a nasal spray for allergies. Cromolyn, by the way, spelled Cromolyn. So you can find information. It is used orally for certain things. It's a prescription drug in this country for mastocytosis, so it has to be prescribed. It's available in Italy over the counter as a drug, as an oral drug. So I don't know. I think that might be an interesting possibility, but whether it'll pan out, I don't know. Yeah, can you say more about someone with EHS? Please define being even more negatively impacted after installation of a smart meter and other EMF producers. Okay, so okay, okay, so EHS is I don't know whether to call it I guess I'll call it a condition, which people argue makes them hypersensitive to the EMFs, and the effects that they see vary from one person to another. They're not all consistent, but the most common of them include the effects that we know the EMFs can cause, namely the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects, and the cardiac effects are among the most common. You also get a lot of skin sensitivity responses, and you can get eye sensitivity and so forth. So you get a lot of sensitivity in different parts of the body, but they you know, which parts of the body are impacted in different individuals are not always the same. So there have been 4 studies done which have shown that that it's possible to identify individuals who have claimed to have EHS, where you can do blinded studies and where you're measuring responses objectively. You're not asking people whether they're reacting, you're measuring whether they're reacting. And it's been shown in each of these studies that there are people who are truly EHS that react when they're exposed and not when they're not exposed, and so you know, so that's important, I think. And of course, you become more sensitive if you know, when you become more sensitive, you know, all these symptoms get much worse. So anyway, yeah. Well, whatever. People want to go, I can go.
It's been going an hour and a half. How about this as a final question, and then can you hang around to take? Oh, okay. Well, here's a question. Somebody's asking about, if I turn off my Wi-Fi, but all my neighbors around me, let's say I live in an apartment complex, how much of a problem is it, all those collective fields coming in?
Well, yeah, it could be a big problem, and people, and it's not at all uncommon for people to have horrible reactions and not knowing anything about them, and then discover that the person next door has a Wi-Fi antenna right across the wall from where they're sleeping. You know, I mean, those kinds of things, you hear these findings all the time, so it can be a big problem. Yeah. Well, it'll vary from one situation to another, and you have to measure it with a meter. I mean, I don't think there's any general thing, but you know, the question is, you know, can you protect yourself from this? And I think the answer is you can, but you know, it's not always easy when you're living in a big apartment complex. You've got your walls, you've got your floor, you've got your ceiling. If you want to put graphite paint all over the place, you can do that, but you know, I don't know that you want to put them on the floors, but you know, but you know, it is possible to do these things, and so for example, if you've got carpeting You know, you could pull the carpeting up, you could take the underfloor of the carpeting, you could put some shielding on it, cover it back up. You know, you can do those things. I mean, it's going to cost money, and it's a fairly, you know, it's a fairly substantial thing, but it's doable. We've got another one. I think, yeah, what can you do with 5G? I think, I guess my opinion is that to deal with legislators, and whether you're dealing with them at the state level or whether you're dealing with them at the city level or whatever, you need a group to do that. You need to show them that there are a lot of people who are very concerned. And so perhaps here in Eugene, maybe you can do something. I don't know. It's a challenge. I mean, you know, but the alternative, I think, is just wait for our destruction. I mean, that's my opinion. Wheeler's not on it anymore, but he was there for a while. Yeah, Wheeler did that. Oh, really? No, George Carlo is not Wheeler. No. George Carlo is another guy. Yeah, it's another guy. George Carlo worked for the telecom industry, and then bailed out, and he was drummed out of the Corps. Anyway, that's a long story, but no, George Carlo. No, eWeb's not. I mean, you know, we're talking about Verizon. We're talking about AT&T. That's what we're talking about at this point. They're planning to put these things in this fall in a number of places, and number of cities around the country. So the smart meter is a different issue than 5G. Yeah, I really think that, you know, that may be true, but the best thing to do is use everything wired if you possibly can. It's less convenient, but, you know, losing your brain function, attacking the DNA of your cells, et cetera, is a whole lot worse than a little bit of inconvenience. The opiates? Okay, that's what I get for opening my mouth. Okay. There's been a lot of discussion about people being addicted to their devices, to their cell phones, and to the internet, and to their tablets, et cetera, right? I believe that much of that is caused by the fact that the EMFs are physiologically addictive in much the same way that the opiates are physiologically addictive. And the reason that I think that is because, well, there are actually a number of reasons. There were studies that were published about 25 years ago by Henry Lai and his colleagues that showed that when this was done in animals, when the animals were exposed to EMFs, that they released high levels of the endogenous opioids that are normally produced in the brain. These are called enkephalins and endorphins. And so you got a lot of enkephalins and endorphins released, and you got a lot of activity of the opiate receptors in the brain as a consequence of that. And so that's exactly what happens when you take opiate drugs. And so I have reason to think that this, in fact, probably leads to the same kind of physiological addiction that we have to opiate drugs, and actually also to cocaine and amphetamines and nicotine, which also act in somewhat similar ways. So this is another thing which causes this whole thing to be even more pathological than one can even imagine. You know, because of course you've got all these people who are addicted, and then how the hell do you get them off? This is on 5G. Yeah, right. I know about that. I signed it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There were actually 2 initiatives on no 5G in space, and the reason for that was the Furstenberg one was this extremely long thing, and there were people who thought that we needed something that was shorter so that somebody might actually read it, and so there are actually 2 of them that are being circulated that have the same intent, but you know, different wording. So. Yeah, well, the other one's being circulated from Europe. Not that that makes any difference in the age of the internet, of, you know, email and stuff, right? Okay, my understanding is that it's not simple to protect your home with graphite paint, metal walls, etc. If you have EMF inside your home, you could be trapping it inside and making it worse. I don't think this is true with graphite. It is true with using things like aluminum foil, but I don't think it's true with graphite. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my understanding of the way graphite works. You know, you can use aluminum foil, which basically bounces the EMFs back. And so if you put aluminum foil on your walls, you'll get rid of the EMFs from outside, but you will concentrate the stuff that's inside because it'll just bounce around in there, and that's a problem. But on the other hand, I don't think graphite works that way, and the reason is you've got lots and lots of different tiny little microfibers in the graphite. And so they bounce things in all kinds of different directions, and at that point you tend to get a lot of what's called destructive interference of the individual photons. So they basically, you know, pretty much disappear. So I don't think it's a problem with graphite, but maybe if someone knows that I'm wrong about this, raise your hand. All right. Nobody. Okay. Thank you.